Welcome to today's Back to the City. I'm very excited to be joined by Matt Levitt. Welcome, Matt.
Yeah, thanks, Simon, for having me on the show.
We're going to spend most of our time focusing on Where All Ends Meet, the second record from Orchid Eaton. But before diving into that, let's kind of contextualize a little with the band name and the previous record, Start of the Dream. I find it interesting that in that title, there's a focus on starting. And then throughout both records, really, there's an awareness of different patterns, beginnings and middles and ends and cycles and so on. Do you have any immediate reflections on the transition from that first record through to the second record, especially given that both of them are kind of raising questions or drawing attention to the idea of a beginning?
Yeah, that's really interesting to kind of reflect on both as a whole. I often find it when I'm working on new tunes that start to take shape as a record. I try not to be aware of what they all mean as a whole to me. In the process of making it, it's kind of more apparent after the fact. One of my personal kind of mantras with making songs for this project is that, they have to reflect some sort of truth to me. And it can often be kind of a long process of, taking an idea that is intriguing or seems like it would be workable, and really trying to condense that down, and it can sometimes take a while to kind of get there. Where I'll start a tune and then leave it for, even a couple months or longer, and, come back to it and revise it and edit it. And especially with lyrics, like that takes the longest time. I mean, lyrically speaking, both of these projects definitely revolve around kind of constant considerations that I have had, and, whether they're, kind of impediments to personal development or noticing these repetitious behaviors in myself. It really was a really useful vehicle to, shine a pretty unflattering light on that, but to be gracious in that exploration too. So meeting your shortcomings with a sense of laughter and gratitude, but also pretty distinct analysis too.
Yeah, absolutely. That is the process, though, of growth, isn't it? The bringing of these patterns to light and this combination of clear-sightedness and compassion as one does so.
I think at the end of the day, like, this project is, since it feels like the most lyrically honest I've been able to be,
Yeah,
it maybe lends itself to a personal sense of growth and kind of reflecting that process.
yeah, absolutely. Let's bring in a couple of metaphors which I encountered on your website, which relate to what we're talking about. So the first one goes back to a passage concerning the band name and the nature of the band. The band name references in part a destroyer called the USS Eaton that crashed 3 times. But there's also a reference to encountering an orchid outside Eaton, Wisconsin. What's the significance of those things?
I kind of went through a process early on before this project was even what it is, where I was kind of doing like almost like free association word play to come up with lyrical ideas. And, in that process, I got a degree in plant science. I hold a great reverence for plants and for trees and for growing things in general, and kind of how quiet they are on Earth, but how important they are, and kind of they live this whole secretive existence that, if you didn't look too hard, you could maybe kind of just breeze by it. Even plants that are pretty unassuming can have really interesting life cycles, and I just find the whole working of the natural world to be really miraculous. So during that free association, I kind of came up with these 2 words that sounded intriguing for some reason, and I wasn't quite sure why. And then as I was kind of going back, and it's the same process that we were talking about earlier about not trying to have too of a preconceived notion about what something could be, but then finding meaning in something that seems serendipitous, like that whole that whole process of working really does feel the most true to me. And so in that, when I was kind of starting putting these things together, I was just searching, like, what is Eaton? Like, what is that in the world? And came up with all these associations for myself. I'm from Wisconsin. So like that had some resonance. The year that they sunk that thing was the same year that like I got really hard into light psychedelic pop music. Not to be too hippy dippy about it, but I mean, it's like free association leads to meaning, you know,
Absolutely.
which I enjoy.
I enjoy the metaphor that kind of gets at that with relation to the new record. It says on the website that the songs were purposefully constructed but patiently waited for, like a cup being filled by groundwater that once fell as rain. And I think that's a really powerful metaphor. It relates to what we're already talking about in terms of not having too fixed a conception of what the thing is going to be. But there is intentionality. An extra dimension of this metaphor is the sense that there had been water flowing as rain, and now there's groundwater. And this is the context within which this patient waiting is happening. What's the significance of those extra features of this metaphor? The fact that there was rain and now there's groundwater.
I do get a sense sometimes that every time I finish a song, or you know, I'm done kind of considering an idea, I have this feeling like, well, maybe that is the last song idea that I'll ever get.
The drought period comes, or perhaps
Right.
the fear that it's not a drought period, but in fact the end of the flow.
Right. Because I'm not a fast songwriter. Like I'll work on stuff, and during that process of working on it and considering it, and sometimes even changing arrangements, it does feel like it has to percolate through parts of my body that I'm not even thinking of necessarily actively, for it to feel true.
This percolation metaphor actually bridges to the second of the metaphors that I had in mind, which is, again, from your website, the image of a front-loading washing machine. And there are times when one knows what one wants to do and does it, and then there are other times when one finds one's mind kind of spinning round, percolating. Just having those two metaphors side by side as we prepare to engage more directly with the material, I think is really interesting, because you've got the one where there is this awareness that a certain process works, there's faith in this container that there will be flowing liquid of some kind. There's an awareness that this is a drought. We don't take the container away thinking that nothing's going to come. And then by contrast, we have this initially seemingly futile turning, cycling, but again, perhaps there's a faith that it's not entirely futile, and you know, the clothes will be washed eventually. But there's a cycle in the one instance, and there's linear waiting for one thing to be filled up in the other. What do you have any reflections on those two metaphors for the songwriting process before we turn to the songs?
I think absolutely. You know, I kind of view the linearity as more the musical or instrumentation process, and the circular development, or the water cycle, so to speak, as like the lyrical process. And just from a general point of view too, you know, kind of reflecting back on personal development too, I think there was at least a sense, you know, just in terms of personal growth, that I felt removed or kind of powerless to have some hand on the wheel too. That it was just these processes that kind of took me along, and I didn't have a lot of agency there, but have come to discover that, you know, I 100% do. You know, whether it's quitting drinking or, you know, whatever the case might be, that we have a lot of possibility to change that flow.
One final metaphor of yours, actually. Let's have a third one. The new metaphor is throwing a layer of suppressive soil over the ego. And the way in which you're drawing on kind of the lexicon and the processes that you study and encounter in your job in organic agriculture, it's really interesting there. So the soil from which something might grow within this metaphor is actually being used to suppress the ego. And I find that really interesting, that it's specifically soil that is being used to suppress. So could you just talk a little bit more about that process, the fact that now we have the ego, and the ego isn't driving the car, and it's not driving the car because it's suppressed by soil specifically?
Yeah, for most people, soil is dirt and it's dirty and that's about it, but really there's a whole unctuous community of life happening there that I don't even pretend to fully understand either. But yeah, it's amazing. And not only that, but the process of making productive soil. Well, it's only productive if it's taken care of and kind of a part of this community ecosystem that feeds it. A lot of some of my circular tendencies were just like a compost bin that needed turning, or that a compost bin that needed air and light and sunshine, and rather than thought patterns kind of driving life, it's like purposely burying your head into this pile that you've created in yourself of all these unresolved issues, or just garbage, or letting that digest, and being confident that through that process that life will thrive.
Mm-hmm. Let's wheel in the album artwork, which is by Luisa Rivera.
Yeah, so Luisa did both the first record and the second record too. Yeah, I hope everyone gets to experience her work. She's incredible. She actually lives in London now too, and does illustration work for all types of different projects, to book covers and magazines, and I find her work just so intriguing and so tactile and real too. It's just I met her when she was a student at MCAD through another music project I was involved in. But yeah, we've just stayed in touch, and I just adore her work and am so humbled that to be willing to work with me on these tunes, because it's so easily reflective of what the tunes mean to me, just from a glance.
I feel that too. You refer to her work as mystical, lyrical, and so very human when you shared the album artwork for the new record. Let's give the two pieces of art, the two covers, a little bit more than a glance, using these visual artworks, which kind of resonate with the music, obviously, as a way to kind of begin to familiarize ourselves with the two records. In the case of Start of the Dream, we have a flower coming into bloom, and the beginningness, the theme of the start of the dream, for me, is really beautifully conveyed there. There are patterns kind of beginning to emerge from this flower. Are there any other specific details of that album cover that you feel are particularly significant? And what is the significance of what I've begun describing there?
I would have to just say in a word, it's possibility. That's like what that album art means to me. That it's kind of starting from this very small, granular idea, but it can kind of float out into the ether. And that's, musically, there's obviously a limited range that we're working with tonally and etc. But that's kind of what it means to me. And I think that she captured that idea so wonderfully.
And then the album artwork for the new record, there's so much going on there. We have an individual in the center in a circle who has a kind of meditative posture and is holding a skull, out of which is emerging a plant, and then working around this image in the top left, we have birds and a volcano. We have a mushroom on the right is being held by a hand. We have individuals watering, putting water on some flames on the bottom right. We have a kind of sun at the top, and this kind of, I don't know if it's the void kind of at the bottom, and it seems like maybe sperm are kind of going into the void. And then we have a green face and what seems to me almost like a kind of plant hand in the bottom left. So do any of those details relate to what's going on musically or lyrically, musically, sonically for you? And to what extent is that all the product of Louise's imagination? To what extent did you provide any parameters to work within for the art?
We did talk a handful of times by email about, kind of what my initial idea was for it, and just some kind of like rough thematic elements, and it was pretty dichotomous. So like, most blatantly birth and death, and fire and water, and like to have it be circular, and a large point influenced completely by when I was working on lyrics for this record. It was kind of intersected with some personal loss in my family from my wife's dad, who we were both very close to, and that was kind of my first really tangible relationship with death. And a lot of people have their own experiences with that, and I have to probably consider myself pretty fortunate to not have to really lean into that feeling too hard before at the age that I'm at now. But I mean, it was an incredibly hard experience, and just kind of being present in that moment and really considering some of those real basic questions of what does happen to us. And I wouldn't say that I have answers to any of those questions necessarily now, but I mean, the Tibetan Book of the Dead was really the first book that I had read that really resonated with me on a level that all of those things kind of came together. And full disclosure, I'm not a Buddhist either, but I mean, that text was just so instructive, and it was calming, and it was really horrifying at some moments too, to just consider as well. But it felt the most true reflection of kind of the moment that I was in, and kind of the lyrical ideas I felt like I wanted to say, but wasn't quite sure how to say them too. So that resource too definitely came into our conversations about it. But I didn't say like I wanted X, Y, and Z images. Like part of that collaborative process is giving collaborators a lot of leeway to be their own selves too in the work, and that I feel like elevates everything along with it. So yeah, we had some conversations, and she came up with all of those images, and she shared some sketches, and it's like, I find the best collaboration sometimes involves the least amount of discussion too. To a point, obviously, but like Brian and I kind of have that same simpatico idea about music making. Like, we don't have to sit down and talk about what tones are going to be present. It just happens, and it is exactly the tonality or whatever that I was feeling, and that always feels like the most right, like it doesn't have to, you don't have to fight to get to the point where you're trying to get to.
Absolutely, yeah. There's you highlighted that Louise's work at once captures the essence of these tunes and elevates them to a whole new plane. So are there any features of that artwork that you feel capture that align with specific features of either the sound or the lyrics, maybe with reference to specific songs?
Oh, that's such a good question. Specifically speaking, I mean, I kind of take it as a whole. Like there's probably not one image that tells that, to me at least, but when I saw it, it was immediate that was like that she had understood it, and yeah, captured both like the fragility of our experience and kind of writ large circular patterns too, that aren't just maybe in one's head, but are like these circular, the inherent circular part of our existence too, that we are born and we live and then we die, and something else comes out of that too, whether it's our bodies are recycled into the stuff of life, or our air is given off for other folks to use. And yeah, the interesting thing that I really wanted to capture was the flower from the first record, to have that be present in the cover of the second one too, as like if the ethos of the first record is like possibility and kind of microscopic examination, this one like zooms out a little bit more. And I think too, like obviously the process of being a dad too has really impacted my everything about my life, obviously, but I mean just lyrical focus too, and those images really resonate with me as well. So yeah, I guess my answer is all of the above.
Both you and Brian experienced losses and births whilst the record was being created, and that inspired you to reflect that threads are tied and untied, matter neither being created nor destroyed. So now there's a focus not just on possibility and the promise of the start of a dream, but there is this zooming out a bit further and observing cycles of life and death. In the Tibetan Book of the Dead, there's a focus on the state of bardo, between death and rebirth. As we've zoomed out and we're attending not just to the moment of promise, but to these broader cycles and beyond this kind of linear view of the beginning through to the end of life, with death being the end. Now we have matter neither being created nor destroyed, and we have this perspective, in one of the influences at least, of something happening beyond death, this bardo state before a new rebirth. Mm-hmm. And there's a focus on the peaceful and the woeful here, the coming together of those components, and self-liberation is related to all of that. So I think a lot of that is setting the scene for what's going on here. Do you have any reflections on any of those components?
Yeah, I really appreciate all the encapsulation of that. I think that's very much resonates with me, and you're also shown everything that you did that was horrible or unkind or coming from a place of anger, that's what you're presented with. It's not, somebody passing judgment on you. This is you basically watching a reel of the choices that you've made and having to live with it. And, most people, and how they describe it is it's, most people are so afraid of either in complete awe of that process or so afraid that they retreat back into life because it's comfortable and it's known, and like how you experience that and develop throughout that process relates to how you, at what stage of awareness you're reborn in, and if you're the ultimate awareness and you can maintain your composure and be accepting and just let it all flow through you, you can be, you're stopping that cycle altogether and you enter the kind of the flow of life basically. So in that way, it's like life is so beautiful, but it's like this whole other cycle as well. And I just, that whole passage really resonated with me at that time and still does. I think about that all the time, about like not what the existential consequences of actions are necessarily, but just what type of reel do I want to watch, if I were actually presented with that.
Two things that are striking me listening to you now. First of all, this, even if treated just as a thought experiment here, the idea of that occurring in Bardo, it's encouraging one to think about the consequences of resisting awareness of one's patterns when there is, after death, extreme resistance to being with and observing, witnessing the patterns of behavior. Then one ends up like the washing machine wheel going around, you're kind of thrown back into the cycle again. So that's the first thing. I wondered if you have any thoughts on that and how that plays out in the music, if so. And the second thing is that this narrative differs quite considerably, of course, from a story where at the point of death, people are sorted the wheat from the chaff into heaven or hell.
It's very overt that you might experience these thoughts as like gods and goddesses, but this is basically your show, like you have created these patterns and these visuals, and this is unique to your experience. And yeah, absolutely. I would say more so, considering this was definitely, top of mind in creating the lyrics, which for this particular record, and they always do for me too. Lyrics take a lot of time for in my process of making tunes, and so definitely present concerns when I was writing the lyrics and rewriting, and I went through a lot of iterations of working on lyrics until they resonated with those ideas that I had read about and felt so moved by, about all that, not even just those interpersonal things that had come up, Brian losing his mom and me, my dad-in-law, and us both becoming dads, and all that stuff is there. But it's often like a starting point to consider some of these bigger questions too.
Let's talk about lyrics then. You've just been discussing the process of getting the lyrics right, and the first lyrics are everything's got to be perfect, everything's got to be said just right.
Which is not on accident.